What do you know about politics? What should you know? Forget views, beliefs, and opinions. Politics is really a science, and that's where we come in. Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell.
I'm Todd Kent, and we're your guides to what's actually happening in politics. We're using our years of experience to navigate political data, media, money, behavior, and more to educate and inform you.
We're back. If you thought political science ended at the end of the election campaign with the inauguration of Donald Trump, no, we've still got lots to talk about. I'm Kirby Goodell from the Bush School.
I'm Todd Kent with the Bush School, the Department of Political Science.
And we have a guest, John Schuessler, who is the co-director of the Al Britton Center for Grand Strategy, also part of the Bush School. And he's gonna help us learn a little bit about what to expect in terms of the world. A lot of what we've done in the past has been focused on domestic politics, but we wanted to talk about America's role in the world and how to get there. But I did want to start off just with an observation about the Trump inauguration that I just can't shake, and that is we really haven't. We have one good example of someone who has been president, who left the presidency, who came back and became president again, and so Trump comes back with more experience. He comes back with a stronger vision. He comes back with actually a stronger electoral return, so he feels like he has a mandate. We can talk about whether that's really a mandate or not, but that sets up a lot of possibilities for success, but also the real ability to overreach, and that's true of domestic and foreign policy.
There's no doubt. Winning an election tends to make candidates feel like they have this big mandate, and really it's only about half the voters voted for them, and so it's not really the case. But I do think you're exactly right. What we saw with Trump coming into office for the second time was much more prepared. And I don't know if he didn't really believe that he was going to win the first time, and then all of a sudden we have to prepare an administration. There was a lot more work done behind the scenes, and I think that should bode well, at least for the early part of his presidency.
Yeah, he really hit the ground running. He was signing everything, throwing Sharpie pens to the crowd, and really playing to the idea that this was going to be a presidency of consequence, and that it was going to be a larger presidency than your typical presidency. Now, we can talk a lot about domestic politics, John, but this also means dealing with the world, and I have a hard time fully appreciating exactly Trump's approach to the world. I've heard people describe him as transactional. I've heard some people call him an isolationist. I know I don't think you're fond of the term. What are we looking for in Trump's approach to the world?
Well, we can, discuss a number of possibilities. Probably the one that fits most naturally is nationalist. Defined narrowly. So I think Trump fancies himself someone who puts the American national interest first and is unapologetic about using strong tactics to advance that interest at the expense, in many cases, of others. What he does not traffic in is the kind of traditional enlightened definition, if you will, of the American national interest, whereby kind of obeying the rules and cooperating broadly with allies and partners and through institutions, we all kind of win over time. He wants America to win more and others to win less. So a more zero-sum view, and that's the transactional part, I would say.
Yeah.
So when you talk about wanting to win, do we see? Do you think there's a strategy there? Is there a right now? Are they thinking right now in their foreign policy discussions? This is the approach we're going to take, or is it more of we're just going to see what happens?
I think there's a hazard of imposing more strategy on any administration than is actually there. So in my classes on American Grand Strategy, first day we contrast the theory of the case with the practice. The sausage making is always uglier than the theory would lead you to believe, but usually patterns emerge. And I think the strategy here is to not shy away from exerting leverage. So if you need to ruffle some feathers, make some threats, you know, do things that other administrations wouldn't consider doing, it will ultimately get others to kind of back down and come more your way. The problem is if the bluff is ever called. So I think that's the general strategy, is to not treat all these more traditional commitments as sacred and to kind of force others to deal directly with your demands.
You know,
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
when we talk about international relations, the terms hard power and soft power. Hard power being more, military and economic, whereas soft power more relational. And if you look at Donald Trump throughout his history, not only as a businessman but as a first-term president, there didn't seem to be a lot of soft power. We're building relationships to get what we want. It was more kind of we're negotiating by kind of being strong or bullying to get what we want. Do you see that?
Yes, I think for the most part. So, to throw in another ism, realism, I think this is the way Trump thinks like a realist. Like, let's all stop pretending. I'm here to advance American power and interests. Xi Jinping is here to advance Chinese power and interests, so on and so forth. So rather than kind of pollute the ecosystem with high-minded talk, let's just get down to business. I'm going to tell you my bottom line, and if you ignore it, there are going to be consequences. But if you don't ignore it, then we could get along. So in that way, in a weird sense, in some ways, Trump, on his best days can kind of get through to other leaders a bit more than his predecessors who, are not willing to kind of get right to the bottom line. Now, the only qualification I would put is that, I guess it depends on how you define American culture. But if soft power is partly about culture, Trump is quintessentially part of American culture.
Yeah.
Reality TV, this kind of reality TV version of what a big business, presence looks like. And I don't want to be unduly dismissive, but, it's hard to say that he doesn't represent American soft power in that way, or at least a certain version of it.
I'm curious, and you were alluding to this, mentioning this, I think maybe even directly, but this idea that Trump's unpredictable gives him a certain ability to negotiate in foreign policy that it helps him in terms of dealing with, especially with foreign adversaries. We don't really know what he's going to do or what he's willing to do because he's unconventional, because he moves the bar, because he speaks in these absolute terms at times, versus maybe we'll call it a Biden approach, push back on that if you want, where you want the world to be predictable, where you want people to understand what the United States stands for, what it wants, how it's going to behave. Is that distinction fair? Is it overblown? Am I overstating the difference? And if it is real, is it an advantage?
I think there's something to that. I mean, let's say if Trump is a realist in the respects we were talking about, then Biden and others before him, were more liberal or liberal internationalists. Yeah. And in that kind of way of seeing things, the relationships, commitments, institutions that the United States has kind of subscribed to or helped build up over time are kind of ends in themselves. They're what lend stability and predictability to things. So you have to kind of honor those or put those first, even if in the short term you're not winning. So your NATO allies, you'd like them to spend more on defense, but the important part is preserving NATO, not forcing them to spend more on defense in the next few years. So you have to kind of work within the strictures of those commitments and institutions. Now, I will say that behind closed doors, the United States has never been shy about throwing its weight around.
Right.
It just, again, Trump is often saying the quiet part out loud. That's what's different. And so I don't want to exaggerate the difference, but it's certainly a difference in tone.
From 2016, when President Trump won the first time till now, has the world changed a great deal? Is this a new world that he's dealing with that maybe the previous experience is not going to shed light on?
That's a good question. I would actually say his, first election was in some ways a symptom or tapping into broader developments that have continued. So, in my line of work, probably the important one is that the war on terror was winding down with Al-Qaeda's, not complete but near total demise as a global threat. And ISIS was being contained, and it was being replaced at the top of the foreign policy agenda with kind of great power politics, the rise of China, Russia's resurgence, if we can call it that. And so, Trump kind of, his administration kind of, really started to see those changes through by elevating great power competition over that old set of issues, taking a tougher tack with China, for example. And that continued under Biden, and I think will continue under Trump. Likewise, though, I don't think this is more in your area or domestic politics. Trump was tapping into people were just more ready to question our traditional way of doing things across the board. And so the foreign policy debate is wider now than it was before 2016. And again, I'd say Trump is more a symptom than just a cause there. When people say there used to be broad agreement that something like NATO was a fairly off-limits issue or sacred in some way. And Trump, no, it's not. And a lot of Americans increasingly agree, especially those on the right who support him.
When it comes to, what you're going to focus on, you saw Donald Trump kind of taking issue with the fact that we've been at war and the previous presidents had taken, 20 years in Iraq and all these years in Afghanistan, and was able to tap into that there was a kind of a wariness on the American public that certainly he used to his advantage.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And he wasn't the first. So Barack Obama was able to kind of make headway in the Democratic Party because he was not forced to support the Iraq War as it was starting in a way a lot of mainstream Democrats at the time were. And that really harmed, I think, Hillary Clinton in 2016. So, there are issues that someone like Trump and someone like Obama agree on, and one of them was that the United States overreached after 9/11. It over-responded to the attacks in ways that were damaging, with Iraq kind of being Exhibit A. And so, Trump was not alone in feeling that American foreign policy had been steered adrift. And this kind of fed into his populist narrative that, this wasn't an accident. It's because we have this foreign policy establishment that's prone to kind of make the same mistakes over and over again, and he's going to come in and shake that up. Again, I don't think that's entirely fair, as things rarely are with Trump, but nor was it completely wrong.
So is it stylistic that we're really seeing a big stylistic difference in terms of how Trump approaches the world, but maybe not so substantive? I mean, and you had mentioned, and I think a lot of people were surprised, if you looked at sort of Biden following Trump, he was maybe less different than, and again, feel free to push back on that if you think that's a wrong characterization, then maybe coming in, someone might have expected, and maybe will Trump be less different than he appears, because a lot of it is bombast and stylistic and not really, he's not going to change America's orientation to the world. He's just going to express it differently in a way that more suits him and that he thinks he gets a competitive advantage on in negotiations and in dealings with foreign powers.
It depends on the issue. So, to break into it, just a touch of, political science, structure versus agency. I think on certain issues, structure is driving the train. Right. Like, for many years after the Cold War, the United States was the only great power that mattered on the scene. And that changes over time with the rise of China. That structure, and Trump is responding to that structure. Biden responded. That's why you see continuity, more focus on competition with China, more concern with China as a quote, potential hegemon in East Asia. Agency might matter more on issues where, there's room for personal style to come through. And I think here some of Trump's kind of pet, issues like all the stuff about, the Monroe Doctrine and Panama. I mean, I can't imagine any mainstream Democrat or Republican talking in this way or talking about, annexing territories. So that, yes, more Trump, less structure. But on things like the rise of China or kind of dissatisfaction with being stuck in the Middle East or resentment toward the Europeans for not doing more to contribute to their defense while we want to pivot to Asia, that's structure in my mind.
So thinking through the near future, who's Trump depending on to be our allies, our friends? Who would he be courting to make sure that we have support there going forward?
And if I can, sort of just add a clarifying question as well. Do our allies worry about how much of an ally we really are because of some of the language? I mean, if you're talking about NATO or you're talking about a South Korea or how are allies viewing us and who can we count on and how are they viewing our role in the world?
I mean, these are great questions. So, I'll just give you my short provisional take. At first blush, exactly because Trump is so transactional about these things. So allies are means and not ends in themselves. We don't have friends. No ally should be feeling too cozy. But that said, some are going to come out better than others. I do think there's a convergence in Europe. The French for some time have wanted Europe to stand more on its own. So you might see a strange kind of chumminess between the Trump administration and the French if they're on the same page about this, whereas others like the Germans, who are more leery of this, are going to be more shaken up. In Asia, exactly because of the focus on China and the presence of China hawks in the administration and in Congress, I think, there's room there for Japan and South Korea and other traditional allies, at least to feel like they can do business with the Trump administration. And then weirdly in the Middle East, this is the one part of his overarching approach or strategy that I've always found a little odd is he really has this thing for Iran. He does not like Iran. So, you'd think if you want to pivot toward Asia, you wouldn't want to remain stuck in the Middle East, but they're very much love Israel and hate Iran. And so there, all those states that also want to isolate Iran, I think that's where you'll see more, I think you'll see more commonality than I think structure would suggest should be the case with a Trump administration. So Israel and then some of the Gulf Arab states. But if they make him look bad, like if the peace breaks down that he feels like he put his name on, who knows? It's a little hard to say.
Yeah, do you have I realize this is not really a fair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So we do have a ceasefire. Does and Trump was very much behind that process, actually very helpful in that process. I was talking about it, just sort of a weird confluence of events where you have an outgoing president who needs a win, you have a new incoming president who wants to show that he can force the two sides to the table. We get a ceasefire. Can we be hopeful about peace in there? I realize I'm asking you an impossible question. So
I mean, it's very difficult to be an optimist about the Middle East and kind of have any kind of longevity in the field, but which not to make light of it. My amateur sense, not being an expert on the region, is a lot depends on how burned out the two sides are by the war. I do think Israel has scored enough decisive hits that Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran would like a break. The question is whether the Netanyahu coalition equally shares that desire for a break, because I think their ambitions have not been fully realized in terms of retaking the West Bank and really kind of in a rather permanent way, dominating their opponents. So I don't want to pin it all on Israel, but I do think of the two sides, Israel is the one that's going to have a harder time kind of accepting a longer-term peace, just because they've scored so many decisive hits and are on the brink maybe of scoring more. So,
yeah, and we've seen some division in the Israel coalition and some possibilities that some of the coalition wants to continue the military action because they've been strengthened militarily, even if it's hurt them reputationally.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure whatever one's personal leanings, if you put yourselves in their shoes, they were kind of told all along, you need to act with more restraint in this war against Hamas, and they didn't. They didn't listen to Biden at all. And yet, if anything, they notched a few wins. That now, whether that's going to redound to their long-term benefit, who knows?
Well, when we come back, we're going to continue to talk about America's role in the world and foreign policy and grand strategy. So we'll be back in just a minute.
Howdy, Ags. You get to hear from me from time to talk about the great things happening here at Texas A&M. But sometimes the best conversations I have happen while I'm wandering around campus and running into our talented faculty, staff, and students. Those are the kinds of real conversations I want you to hear on our brand new podcast called At Ease. I hope you'll join me, along with Chief of Staff Susan Balabina, and a bunch of smart and talented Ags to talk about things that really matter here in Aggieland. Gig 'em.
KAMU Studios loves hiring students. We develop aspiring media professionals by providing hands-on experiences and letting them create for audiences of all ages. Recent graduate Maria Moctezuma.
You can come in with zero experience and come out of here a professional. I definitely wouldn't have gotten a lot of the interviews or opportunities I had if it wasn't for this job.
Eager to learn more? We'd love to connect. Email us today, kamu@tamu.edu.
And we're back. We were talking a little bit about allies and about Trump's relationship with allies and the signals that he sends to allies. And one of the things, I was in South Korea over the summer, they were very much worried about a Trump presidency and about what it meant for their ability to defend themselves, and especially would they have to develop nuclear weapons? And if they develop nuclear weapons, does Japan then have to develop nuclear weapons? What's the status of our allies, and maybe we can think about Asia first and then turn to Europe?
Sure. So I think a few points to make. One is, these concerns don't arise in a vacuum. I do believe in his first term, Trump, I would say, directed most of his ire at our European allies for, quote, not paying their fair share. And he had that infamous quote where he said, I'd actually welcome, or I can't remember how he put it, I hope Russia invades, those who don't pay up, which was, obviously received poorly. But he also made some comments about our East Asian allies, Japan and South Korea, kind of similar claims. Well, they need to pay the full cost of, American forces that are stationed there. We might have to revisit the relationship. So, I understand the concern. That said, you can go back a long way. There's always been a kind of Asia first strand in Republican foreign policy thinking going all the way back to the early Cold War. I think that strand still lives in certain respects. There are many China hawks in the GOP today. There are China hawks in the new Trump administration, and they are very focused on containing China or ensuring that it can't harm American interests, which you need allies in the region to do. You need these allies to help contain China because they're the ones that are going to have to station American military forces, contribute their own military forces, participate in economic restrictions, isolate China diplomatically if need be. So I would expect that, ultimately the Trump administration would end up taking a softer line with our East Asian allies than with our European ones, but I wouldn't rule out some bluster along the way.
Yeah. And is there a value to the bluster just in the sense of is it better for us if our European allies are paying more for their own defense, building up more military, if also in Asia our Asian allies are building stronger militaries?
I personally do think that these alliance relationships were overdue for a reset. Another IR scholar, international relations scholar, Barry Posen, uses the terms kind of cheap riding and reckless driving to talk about some of the pathologies that can creep into American alliance relationships. Cheap riding kind of speaks for itself. Allies under contributing, to the common defense. Reckless driving is, well, if you're an ally that feels too protected or reassured by the United States, you might take reckless actions that you wouldn't otherwise take. It's the equivalent of moral hazard in insurance. And so, Posen's argument is it would be healthier if our allies were a little less sure of our commitments to them. They would be less inclined to engage in cheap riding or reckless driving. The problem is if they don't have any if they don't feel reassured at all about the American commitment, then they're going to go it alone, like considering nuclear weapons or accommodating, China if you're South Korea, or Russia if you're Germany. So, that's part of the art of grand strategy, if you will, is reassuring allies, but maybe not too much.
It's a very interesting. And when you point out the things that Donald Trump says publicly that maybe people in the past wouldn't say, and is that his form of negotiation? Is his take an extreme stance, an extreme statement, and knowing that in the deal they're going to get something less than that, but it's still going to be better than what we have now. And is there a point where that wears out our allies? Where that becomes problematic, continuing to take that approach?
I think that's one risk of the approach, that you undermine trust to such an extent that allies, begin considering these alternatives to the alliance that we would find unfavorable. But there's another risk which is a little different, which is if Trump is too transparent about the fact that he's just looking for some win, however modest, he sets himself up to be played. And you can kind of see evidence of this where, now that other governments are more wise to him, they will signal, no, we're ready to deal, and then they'll make some small concession and say, see, you just got a big win, Mr. President. And so, even the Ukrainians, that he expressed all this skepticism about kind of aiding Ukraine unconditionally. But I think, they've figured out that if they can say to Trump, oh, if there's a peace on our terms, it'll be a win for you. They've figured out his tell. So, where he needs to have some discipline is not to be so, I guess, satisfied with any win that he doesn't get played himself.
There's a lot of kind of issues looking forward. They're a continuation of what's been happening. Russia, Ukraine, the Gaza Strip, the war in Gaza, the continuing China, Taiwan. What do you see on the horizon that, at least in the near term, that the Trump administration needs to get their hands around?
Well, those are certainly the big three. And as I'm someone who kind of self-identifies as a restrainer as far as American foreign policy goes, I would like the United States, I guess, to be less militarily engaged abroad and more inclined toward peace, if you will. And I think, whatever your views on the president, he does he claims to hate war and like peace. And so, again, in terms of these maybe surprising possibilities, if he feels some ownership of the peace process in the Middle East or of kind of bringing the stalemated war in Ukraine, making some progress on negotiations, or even, I think, less likely, finding a more stable status quo with China, I in a weird way, he might be better positioned to make some progress just because he is more willing to kind of, call into question some of the commitments or principles usually that constrain American presidents from looking for diplomatic solutions.
Are of those issues, or maybe some issue we haven't really hit on yet, what do you wake up in the middle of the night and go, oh no? And maybe you don't do that. Maybe you sleep perfectly well. But I joke with my students sometimes that I wake up in the middle of the night and worry about the status of democracy and the future of America. But is there a particular hotspot that is especially troubling to you?
Well, a two-part answer. So again, if you're a self-described restrainer, you are supposed to do less of that, right? You're supposed to be, I guess, more relaxed about the threat environment, feel less urgency for the United States to take the lead in protecting every endangered state or leading the charge on every solution. On the other hand, restrainers do fear war, especially great power war, very deeply. And so the one that keeps me up at night is something with China over Taiwan, because I think if that could degenerate very quickly, and if it does, I'd say the best case scenario is a protracted conventional war that would severely test the international economy, the American military, and the worst case is, of course, escalation to nuclear war, which is hard to even contemplate. So that, even the possibility of that, even if it's a low probability, I would say under 10%, that is the one scenario that keeps me up at night. There's been too much chatter these days about, are we on the way to World War III? And usually it has to do with this notion that, like, America's adversaries are all ganging up across regions against us. And I try to tamp that down as much as possible. I don't find it helpful. But, one war with China, just in terms of the sheer scale and cost, is more than enough, even if it's not a, quote, World War III.
But doesn't that put the Trump administration in a disadvantage when they negotiates with Japan and South Korea and trying to work out an agreement how things would go forward, and that he needs them, but also doesn't want to in the economic times to continue to pay for everything, and so does this put it at a disadvantage?
It could. I think maybe the more positive gloss is that, he and the United States more broadly could be well positioned to take advantage of developments that are already happening and are well outside our control. So if China is rising or has been rising, if it poses more of a threat, especially to its neighbors, than it has in the past, those neighbors will be incentivized, hopefully, to kind of do more on behalf of their own interests. And the United States can encourage that while helping, in all the ways that we uniquely can. So, again, I do think it constrains the ability of the United States, I think, to make incredible abandonment threats, as I think we can more credibly do in Europe. But I don't think that doesn't mean these alliances won't be rebalanced in ways that I think many American elites would like to see regardless.
Do you see, when you think of China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, kind of buddying up together, do you see, is this a short-term development that's not going to last, or do you see that this is something that kind of in the George W. Bush administration, it was the axis of evil, but now this is a new kind of group. Do you see that going forward into the future?
Well, and this is where I'm kind of showing my hand. We talked about realism. This is a common, as a realist, you tend to see other states as distinct entities with their own interests that only partially overlap. If you think about the world in a different, more ideological way, as a realist wouldn't, what you would say is, well, these are all states that are illiberal and have serious grievances against the liberal international order that the United States is associated with, and they're tired of being marginalized in it. And so in that sense, maybe there is something to this talk of an axis of resistance, and it could have some longevity. As a realist, I am skeptical. I don't see China, Russia, Iran, North Korea as having enough overlapping interests to form any kind of coherent bloc. And we Americans have done this before. We greatly exaggerated how cohesive the Axis alliance was before Pearl Harbor. I mean, the Japanese and the Nazis were operating more or less independently. But it's understandable, when you think ideologically, liberal versus illiberal, this is just a natural way of breaking up the world.
So I know you have a really interesting book on how presidents have used deceptions in these particular cases, and how they've used deception, for example, in World War II, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in order because democracies generally don't really like war. Or we think that theoretically there are good reasons to think that democracies don't want to go to war, and so deception becomes necessary. Do you think Trump ends up falling in that pattern despite his sort of, I don't really want to be involved in wars, or I want to end foreign wars?
Sorry to be self-referential, but after I finished that book, one of the first things I was asked to do was to write a short essay applying its insights to Trump. And I really struggled with this, and basically ended up saying the insights from the book don't apply very well to him. So the presidents I looked at, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, George W. Bush, they were trying to cement broad support for war and to kind of tamp down on opposition. And that's why they resorted to deception. They weren't flat out lying in most cases. They were just either soft pedaling or sugarcoating why we're going to war, how committed we are to it. Trump, I've never seen any evidence he's trying to build broad support for much of anything. He will just simply say, this is what I want, and all those who disagree with me are terrible people. So he is a divider and not a uniter. And so as I talked a bit about in the essay, I think the logic, when he was being deceptive, usually he was kind of just telling kind of obvious lies to kind of puff him and his own story or his kind of constituents up. It just felt to me like a totally different logic to what FDR and LBJ and George W. Bush were trying to do.
There's this peculiar, though, thing that he did. And, you know, he does some odd things every once in a while. But on the one hand, talking about we're not going to be as involved in foreign entanglements, that wasn't the language that he used. But then he turned around and said, but manifest destiny. We're going to expand territory. Never liked the Panama Canal treaty to begin with, and we shouldn't have given away, and it's ours, and China's running it. Lots of stuff that you could go in there. Is that? I'm not sure how to interpret that in light of sort of the more realist oriented message of we're only going to be involved when it's really America first message. It sounds like it's I don't even know what it sounds like. And bring back imperialism, expand American territory, take back it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think one reaction you're hearing is this sounds a lot like the 19th century. You know, we haven't been talking about annexing territory so openly in a long while. And the pushback from, you know, neighbors like Canada and Panama has been pretty swift and unambiguous because, you know, even if it's a polite fiction, you know, and yes, there are power inequities, but those are supposed to be softened through diplomacy and acknowledgement of each other's sovereignty. And so this kind of rough talk is pretty unusual. Now, that said, the basic impulse behind some of this is realist and it's fairly old, which is, you know, we are the United States and we dominate the Western Hemisphere. And really, other great powers are not welcome to kind of meddle here. The Monroe Doctrine, this is what that was about. And Trump is by no means the first to kind of throw American weight around in the hemisphere or threaten to. I mean, I often tell my students, if you ever doubt, you know, how committed the United States is to the Monroe Doctrine, look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. We absolutely lost our minds over, I mean, really, you know, there was a serious risk of global war over some missiles in Cuba that really didn't make a lick of difference because the Soviets already had a bunch of nuclear weapons that they could have fired from other places. So the only way I can explain it is that some red line was crossed meddling so blatantly in our neighborhood after we had said don't do that. I think you'd find the same reaction if Mexico or Canada threatened to form an alliance with a rival. Again, we would colloquially lose our minds. So the impulse, I don't think, is that unusual. But what I find so Trumpian, it's not necessary. You know, we can get all the access we want in Greenland through the traditional methods. We are not getting a raw deal in the Panama Canal. And if we were, there are so many ways to resolve this. He does seem to have this need to kind of very publicly make it about him and him winning. That I find odd and counterproductive after a point.
You know, you talk about this idea of kind of avoiding future wars and staying out of it. It always struck me is that a leader that says that has to at some point say, "There's something going on and we're not going to get involved." Yeah. So you know what region do you see a region of the world or maybe a conflict where you say that might be one where Donald Trump would say we're not going to be part of that?
Well, I mean, in a way, I think Ukraine is that case in that I think there's an interesting counterfactual where American backing would have scaled down regardless of who won, but I think it'll be more it'll happen quicker and it'll be more obvious under Trump. I think in general what this is signaling is that, you know, NATO is still exists, but I don't think the United States has the same commitment to defending all of Europe that it did in the past. All of Europe, I'll say. So I think that's one area where it's impossible to say. If Putin was stupid enough after losing most of his army in Ukraine to try something against Poland, I think there's an open question whether to what extent our Article 5 commitment would be met. So that might be an opportunity to say no. But I'm not sure elsewhere. I think my hope is that, as with many things, he's going to be able to come in right behind Joe Biden and just take credit for things that were happening anyway, in terms of some of these fights starting to wind down, like in the Middle East and in Europe, rather than having to actively say no to other opportunities to get involved.
So we've talked a lot about threats. I'm also curious if you see any unique opportunities, and maybe put the question a little broader, thinking about the next 4 years or the next year, the next whatever time frame you want to adopt. And you were talking about conflicts winding down. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about foreign policy and the U.S. role in the world? Or Trump called his inauguration speech was about the golden age. I don't want to call it the golden age, but should we be optimistic about the future?
I mean, as a realist, I am optimistic, but for strange reasons, because, as a realist, I believe that too much choice is a bad thing in foreign policy. So after the end of the Cold War, when the United States was the only great power in the system, my argument be we had too much choice about what to do. We could pursue too many interests with too little regard for the cost. I just can't imagine a war on terror being waged as long as it was at such profligate cost if there had been more serious issues to deal with. Terrorism is a serious threat, but it's not an existential one. And it's just mind-boggling the amount that was invested to kind of to deal with this. So I feel like that, in a way, the United States had the luxury of doing stupid things for too long, to put it bluntly. So now, exactly because the United States is now having to deal more with other great powers, especially China, we have to set priorities, make harder choices. It's uncomfortable and the danger level is higher, but I think it'll lead to smarter policy. So in that respect, I am more optimistic, but I guess not for happy reasons.
Well, I don't know about you, Todd, but I feel a lot better having this conversation.
No, it's been great. I think a lot of times we focus so much on domestic politics that we forget about the important role that America plays in the world, and we're certainly going to have some exciting times ahead.
And we know if we're not, if we ignore the world will find us. So thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate it. That's all the time we have for this show, and we'll be back soon.
Thank you so much.
Inside Political Science is a production from KAMU, Aggieland's Public Television and Radio. For more information, visit tx.ag/Inside Political Science. Have a question for our experts? Email them at insidepolici@tamu.edu. Also, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss a new episode.